Hello, and welcome to our latest Planet Now conversation in environmental studies. I am very pleased to welcome you today. We have an outstanding panel and two wonderful moderators who will be guiding you through a really exciting conversation on food in the justice system. My name is Weston Twardowski, and I am the program manager for the Diluvial Houston Initiative through the Center for Environmental Studies and Humanities Research Center here at Rice. And I'm just going to tell you a little bit about the program before we begin. Our webinars, these Planet Now series, emphasize a habit of conversations across disciplines and communities about important questions facing us now. We plan these sessions in conversation with our enst curriculum, and these are free and open to the public at all times. We also record these events, so they're available for free for the general public to glean and learn and continue to enjoy these wonderful conversations after we have them. A few acknowledgements. Rice University is located in Houston, which is on the Gulf Coast of Texas, and we acknowledge that we live on the unceded ancestral lands of the Karankawa, the Sana, Kwa'alakan, and Atakapa Ishak peoples. I also want to make some institutional acknowledgements before we jump in. I'd like to thank the deans of both the humanities and architecture, Kathleen Canning and Igor Maranovich, who make the environmental studies program possible. Richard Johnson, who is, and Joseph Campana, who is the director of the Center for Environmental Studies, and Richard Johnson, who is the associate director, who are also the creators of this Planet Now conversation series. Richard is also the executive director of sustainability at Rice. And I want to thank Sophie for putting this together, really. This was her brainchild, and I'm very excited to welcome our postdoctoral fellow for the Diluvial Houston Initiative, as well as the garden manager and a Rice PhD alum, Jade Hagan, to co-moderate this event. And with that, I will turn it over to our wonderful moderators.
So thank you all for being here. I'm just going to briefly introduce our three panelists. We have Tommy Garcia-Pratz here from Houston as well. He's the founder of Small Places LLC and a leader in community impact agriculture, again, here in Houston. We also have indigenous chef and advocate Sean Sherman, sometimes known as the Sioux Chef. And we're pleased to welcome artist, writer, and cook Tunde Wey. I believe he's based in New Orleans right now, and we're excited to talk to all of them.
I'll say a word about how we're going to proceed. Each guest is going to give a brief introduction to their work and tell us a little bit about themselves in sequence. And then we have some questions to guide our discussion, but anybody in the audience or anybody also on the panel should feel free to put questions in the chat at any time, and we'll be happy to get conversation moving. So welcome to our guests, and we're so excited to have you. And Tommy, if you would like to start.
Yes, thanks Sophie and Jade for having me. My name is Tommy Garcia-Pratz, and I'm a native Houstonian, and I think these sorts of conversations are really important to me as a native Houstonian, just trying to bring this conversation and folks like Sean and Tunde, who aren't from Houston, but have like such an incredible experience and knowledge to share with us about food justice. So yeah, just really excited to have this opportunity. I am not a farmer. I did not grow up a farmer. I mean, I've been farming for 12 years now, and I come across so many people that have only known me as a farmer. So they kind of assume that that's kind of been my background, but I grew up in, a middle-class white family just right outside the loop of Houston. And my story of food justice really starts with that story of being in a home of privilege. My mother stayed at home, and I think even though we were a family of 10 boys, it was a large family. It's like our meals were like a really big event. And when you grow up and there's always food on the table, and there's not really this thought of anything beyond that being normal, I think the concepts of food justice and food access and things like that just aren't at the forefront of the conversation. It was, we're here, we're having our meal, we're cooking dinner, and you know, it's a non-issue. And I think when you come from a house of privilege like that, it can seem so basic, just that sort of thing, just sitting down for a meal and it being cooked by someone who has time to cook it and the means to drive to the store and access to a grocery store down the road. We take it for granted that that is just how everyone's experience is. And it wasn't until, you know, getting older and really my first experience in living in Nicaragua that really shifted my perspective on the entire world. I know a lot of people, when I was going to Nicaragua, just told me how afraid of the place that I should be, and bringing up a lot of just historical and racial issues that were kind of, make me nervous about being in a different place. And my experience was just completely the opposite. And I think it was actually being in Nicaragua that really transformed my perspective on my own country, just why our culture operates like it does. And that's really what got me started in food and farming. And I was looking to work on a farm in Houston, and one farmer told me, if you want to learn about farming, then don't farm in Houston. And it was probably the best advice anyone's ever given me, because I ended up farming in Maine on an organic farm for 6 months, and then Iowa on a large scale organic farm, and then back to Nicaragua working on a large scale farm there. And when I returned to Houston, I just assumed I'd find a farm in this massive city to work on. And to my own surprise, there were basically no farms for me to work on. And I think that really just kind of jettisoned me into, you know, why is that the case? If we're a metropolitan area of 7 million people and there's no farms, then, you know, where does the food come from? You know, in Harris County, which is the 3rd or 4th largest county in the US, there's no certified organic farms. And, you know, in Jefferson, Maine, the town that I farmed in, there was 2 organic farms for a town of 2,500 people. So just kind of engaging in this conversation, going to health presentations from hospitals and clinics, and, you know, we talk about diet-related health issues and things like that, but never does agriculture kind of get brought into the conversation around health as something that's applicable, pertinent, relevant. And I think that's really where my 2 brothers and I saw us having an opportunity of really impacting the conversation and being a part of the conversation, of how do we bring agriculture as a really important aspect of the conversation of food, health, food justice. And I'd say when we started, one thing we knew is that we didn't know that much. I mean, obviously I had 3 years of farming experience, but we got in basically believing that this is important and needed to be something that's a part of our city. And we started Small Places, which was our LLC and umbrella organization that founded Finca Tres Robles, which is our urban farm. And we're an urban farm I describe on purpose. It's not because we think it's hip and cool to be a farm in the city. We saw it as really a strategic initiative for engaging our community and our city in the concepts of agriculture and community health. You know, being 2 miles from the center of downtown Houston makes us, you know, within a tangible distance of a huge swath of households, individuals, peoples, and the center of power, economics, governance, culture. So yeah, we think food just needs to be, and agriculture in particular needs to be a part of that conversation. So Finca Tres Robles was founded in 2014 on 1.25 acres of land in Houston's East End, specifically the Second Ward. We've been there for 7.5 years, and initially this was just going to be our farm to grow food and feed people. And I think really quickly we saw and just learned and are still learning just how deep the challenges are, how systemic the issues are, how ingrained they are, and just preventing and keeping most communities from having the tools to be healthy. And I think something that really changed a lot for us was when we learned that zip code is really the best indicator of one's health outcomes. And, you know, it's so easy to get in the big conversations of the food system and the problems around it. I mean, the food bank served 217 million meals between March of 2020 to March of 2021 in the start of the pandemic. Our independent school district doled out 44 million pounds of produce, and like that's literally what our food system is here, and it's not really a food system. And I think from our perspective is how do we engage that issue from like a really practical and place-based way, because I think so much of the challenge around food is how do we as individual people get involved in you know, moving the needle towards a more just food system. And I think that's something that we've struggled with as an organization, of how do we really make our farm something that is, you know, we produce food that's affordable for people. We have programming that people can access that's engaging and that creates a conversation to move, to inform, because I can relate as a Houstonian of just like having zero perspective and zero understanding of the realities of the food in our city. So our farm grows about 20,000 pounds of produce a year. And our goal is to keep 100% of that produce in our community. And a big part of that is just like fostering an ecosystem of health in our place. So it's primarily the East End's primarily Latinx. Neighborhoods range from about 70 to over 90% Latinx, and struggle with, beyond just food access, other issues around just like environmental quality. We're like a pretty industrial part of town, and just housing prices. I know 2/3 of our community are renters, and half of those are rent burdened, which mean over 50% of their rent, or 50% of their income is going towards rent. So it's like 1 in 3 individuals in our community. So recognizing that, you know, this is, you know, I know questions will probably come up around it, but justice is not just like food justice is part of, you know, larger issues around just basic community needs being met. So we have a CSA, a 9.5-month CSA program. We do a weekly farm stand, and then we also have some other just like food distribution programs that we call the Neighborhood Produce Program, which is a subsidized CSA program to food insecure families in our immediate service area, and then have partnerships with the local federally qualified health clinic, El Centro de Corazon, that we deliver shares to for food insecure families as well. A big part of our work is just getting people onto the farm. So we have a really robust field trip program for kids from preschool up to college age, and then just community gatherings, events, from concerts to potlucks. Really just how can we get people onto our farm thinking about where agriculture fits into their lives and why it's relevant, and you know, should be a part of the broader conversation of just a well-designed community.
Great. Thank you so much. I think we were going to go to Sean next, please.
All right. Hi. I'm just going to do a quick little PowerPoint because it'll just be easier to talk about all the work that we do because we do a lot. So I'll try and run through this really fast. I know we're doing like 10 minutes, right? And I'm going to go from here. All right, let me share my screen really fast. Okay. So my name is Sean Sherman. I was born and raised on Pine Ridge Reservation in South Dakota. You guys can see my screen fine, huh? And I am based in Minneapolis, Minnesota right now. I'm enrolled with the Oglala Lakota Sioux tribe. We have quite a few projects going on here in Minneapolis. We have our nonprofit called Natives, which is an acronym for North American Traditional Indigenous Food Systems, where we have a nonprofit kitchen called Indigenous Food Lab. We also have our company, the Sioux Chef, where we have a food truck, a catering operation, and a restaurant called Owamni that just opened up last year. Owamni by the Sioux Chef. It's right on the Mississippi River, downtown Minneapolis. Our work is more than just being restaurants because we're just really trying to bring indigenous foods into the modern world and indigenous knowledge when it comes down to it. And a lot of the work that we do is just looking at where we are, especially in history, and just understanding like why aren't there Native American restaurants in every single city in every single region when no matter where we are, like we're standing on indigenous land, and all of North America's history begins with indigenous history. So there's just a lot of pieces to address of how indigenous peoples have been treated and are still treated today. So a lot of this work is just really pushing back against colonialism, which affects a lot of us. So colonialism is obviously the policy or practice of acquiring full or partial political control over another country, occupying it with settlers and exploiting it economically. And this is something that we address because it happens to indigenous peoples on a global scale. And we've never actually exited an era of colonialism, as it's still actively happening in many places around the world. Brazil is a really great example of some place where indigenous peoples are being murdered and removed from their land spaces. So people and nations can extract resources that will make them rich. So a lot of this work that we do is just trying to get people to remember how little history there is in the United States, and just how did the United States get to be to what it is today. And the United States has done a very good job of ignoring that. It stole so much immense land space from indigenous communities in a very short time period, largely from the 1800s onwards. And it also does not like to talk about how it also stole an immense amount of indigenous peoples from Africa to build a lot of the foundational structures of what we have today in the United States. And, I think there's, as we move forward with understanding the true histories of the United States and how the effects of colonialism has negatively impacted so many cultures, and how dangerous that is, and how we're living in this world of capitalism and globalization as a direct result. And even, land ownership is still a direct result of this, because 98% of all privately owned land in the United States is still owned by white European descendants. And that's a direct result of this situation of just the United States just plundering and taking over so much land space in such a short time period. And this affects a lot of us as indigenous peoples, especially indigenous communities in the West, where I grew up, because we saw so much just natural destruction of our land space. If you can imagine what most of the West would look like if there was still old growth forests everywhere, and all of these communities thriving amongst that, but also things like the removal of bison, which is just kind of an environmental catastrophe of just removing an entire species, almost that were hundreds of millions of them were out there. And when you study history, you can see all these talks in Congress of how focused it was to pay hunters to just completely wipe out the animal with the sole intention of damaging the indigenous communities and making them easier to subdue, which they accomplish in a very short time period. So they wipe out almost, over 99% of those animals during that time period, mostly in the 1860s. We also just see like the destruction of crops and seeds, so much farmland, so much indigenous agriculture just being completely ignored. We have no idea how many precious heirloom seed varietals were lost during the 1800s. And we just, we see it from the very start. General Washington sends, or President George Washington sends out General Sullivan in 1877, I believe. And they just marched through New York, and within a single summer push all the tribes into Canada. And, with the sole instructions of just complete destruction of all those environments and all those farms and cities. And there's like 6 mile by 6 mile farm fields going on. There's so much really just great agriculture happening in that region at that time, and they just burn it all down for the sake of like taking the land, just parceling it out and making a ton of money off of the acreages, which is a big chunk of how the United States makes a ton of money. And, as we're pushed onto reservation systems in various parts all across the United States, everything changes for us. And it's our education system that really gets hit the most. So we have to go through this really intense period of assimilation, which is my grandfather's and grandparents' era at the turn of the century. And, we just lose so much because they're trying to turn us into something that we're not. And we lose thousands of generations of cultural knowledge during this time period, again, which is just this direct result of colonialism. And we're forced to learn other languages. We're forced to learn Christianity and things that had nothing to do with us. And in the 1900s, it's not a much better era for us as indigenous peoples because we're not citizens officially until 1924, which is within my grandparents' generation. We see in a really intense period of Indian adoption, 1941 through 1967, on top of all sorts of modern day relocation efforts that happened during that same time period. But during this time period, 1/3 of all Native children are put up for adoption and taken from their families, which is a huge number. And people should be talking about that catastrophe and how much damage that's happened. Again, just stripping us from so much of our cultural knowledge and removing us from our own people and from our own communities, and not being able to be raised by Native peoples to be able to maintain some of our cultural ways. We can't vote like most people until 1965. And where I grew up in South Dakota, we couldn't even vote until the 80s because the South Dakota government wouldn't allow votes from unorganized counties, which meant Native counties. We couldn't celebrate religions until 1978. That's pretty much insane because that's within my lifetime that it was illegal to celebrate Native religions up until that point. And so then growing up, we're just completely removed from our food system. So I grew up with commodity food program foods, which is really unhealthy. And we have data which showcases what happens to entire communities when they're surviving off this food source. And it's just not healthy. There's just way too many carbs, way too many salts, way too many sugars. So our work is just identifying what are indigenous food systems, what is indigenous diversity, and showcasing that. There's so much indigenous diversity still out there alive today. And we should be really thinking about that because that's how it's laid out. And it's not just here in North America, but on a global scale. But there's still 634 tribes in Canada, 576 now, I believe, in the US, and 20% of Mexico identifies as indigenous, which are huge numbers. So that's a big work of our nonprofit is all about. Is really just focused on returning access to indigenous education and returning access to indigenous foods, and not just here in the United States, but looking at it as a global issue. So, because we could be doing the same work everywhere. Not just, we can be in Canada and we can be in Mexico, South America, Africa, India, Southeast Asia, Australia, New Zealand, Hawaii, you name it. But it's really focusing on what is decolonized education, what is indigenous education. And indigenous education is basically giving us the blueprint to survive as a community with primarily plant knowledge when it comes down to it. But there's so much curriculum that we could be developing and saving and reclaiming for indigenous peoples on a global scale. And we really have the answers as indigenous peoples across the globe of how to live sustainably within our own environments. So it's really important that we focus on just stewarding indigenous knowledge bases and trying to save them for future generations. And that's a big part of what our nonprofit is doing, is building that curriculum actively and doing it through the language of food, which is extremely important. And it's the one language that we all speak. And it's just makes us, really conscious about how we're doing things. So at our restaurant, we're just very choosy about where all of our products come from, so we're trying to purchase everything from indigenous producers locally and then nationally, and then we just support our local food systems around us with a preference on BIPOC in general, and just trying to understand how privilege works and really pushing again, trying to elevate people who don't have that privilege built in but are still really trying to do something great. And we're just trying to lead a new generation of more indigenous chefs so we can start seeing more restaurants out there eventually. And we just really want to focus and get education, especially especially to tribal communities, on how we can help them set up more community gardens, and really just understanding how permacultural systems can work, and just putting food intentionally all around us so that we can process and create a lot of pantry for our own community. And just giving opportunity to be super creative and evolving, because we're not trying to create food from the past, we're trying to evolve it into the future generation. And we've removed colonial ingredients. So for us, we don't use any dairy, wheat flour, cane sugar, beef, pork, or chicken, because those ingredients didn't exist here on this land space. And we're just really focused regionally, what are regional indigenous foods. So the restaurant's been doing really well. It's been really busy, and it's just giving us that proof of concept that we can run a decolonized focused restaurant in the modern world today. And we're really doing all this work for future generations, because I just want the next generation to know where to access their foods, be able to learn about their foods, be able to learn about their true histories and not be told lies about situations. And we just feel like this is, for us, an indigenous evolution and revolution at the exact same time. And we just believe that we can, as indigenous peoples across the globe, lead us all into a better place. And I'm gonna stop share. And that's my intro.
Great. Thank you so much. And thank you for sharing your slides as well. It's wonderful to see. So Tunde, I think we don't have video for you, but we could hear you before. So you're up next.
Thank you. Can you hear me now? Okay, great. I'm actually not in New Orleans. I'm in Lagos, and it's midnight over here. So that's why my screen isn't on, because it's dark. So depending on who I'm talking to, I say I'm an artist, or I'm a cook, or I write. I think maybe the best way to describe the work that I do would just be talk about my latest project, or two of them. So sometime last year, I created this sort of like satirical digital token that I call Bullshit. And folks can purchase the Bullshits on a marketplace that I created and I control. And the idea is that you use these chits in exchange for products that I will drop in some future. So last year, I released 100 of these, I believe, at $10 a piece. There wasn't any product attached to it at the time. And then they were all sold. And then in the next couple of weeks, maybe a month, we're going to be releasing, in partnership with a bakery in New York, a bread that it's called agege bread. So agege bread is a popular bread sold in Lagos here. It's pretty inexpensive. It's ubiquitous. A lot of folks sort of like have it as their meal, because it's relatively cheap. So anyway, we're producing it in New York and we're selling it for $100. To give you some sort of reference, the bread is sold in Lagos for, I want to say, maybe 50 cents. The idea is to talk about the rise in commodity prices and the impact of that rise in commodity prices on folks in the global South, specifically, because this is my concern, folks on the continent. We in the continent generally export commodities. We don't set those prices. And then in exchange for the stuff that we export, we get foreign exchange, which is US dollars, so that we can buy the goods that we need. So medicine, food, and capital goods. But sort of like this relationship between the continent and the global North is exploitative on very many levels. So the idea behind the project ultimately is to shift the burden of costs, shift the burden of responsibility away from brown and Black folks on the continent to folks in the global North, and to begin a conversation about what a new sort of like global financial system can look like that isn't as exploitative as the current one. So that's one project. The next project that I'm doing is in partnership with sort of like an independent spirits brand called Good Vodka. So in Nigeria, there's a popular drink. It's a spirit made from palm, so it's a palm-based spirit, and it's called local gin, kai kai, or ogogoro. So basically, we're shipping the distillate to the US. We have a partnership with a distillery in Long Island. They are redistilling it and infusing it with herbs and spices from Nigeria, and then we're selling that spirit for $192.42, I believe. It's for 375 ml bottle, so that probably makes it the most expensive spirits in the universe. But the idea behind that is Nigeria's external debt. I don't have the exact numbers, but if you divide Nigeria's external debt, that's the debt that is denominated in US dollars by the number of US residents of drinking age, then you get 192. So again, this concept of shifting the burden, what would happen if, everybody in the US of drinking age helped pay down Nigeria's debt, Nigeria being the largest economy and the most populous country in Africa, and being representative of the consequences of the exploitative global system that we participate in, but that the global north disproportionately benefits from, or maybe even I would even say exclusively benefits from. So that's the sort of work that I do. I sort of use food to talk about things that matter to me and to some other people.
That's great. Thank you so much to our guests. I think before, we have some questions starting to come in the chat. Before we get to those, I also wonder if any of the panelists have anything they would like to respond to in what you heard in each other's intros. That would be great, or we can move into some of the broader questions that we have prepared as well before we get into the audience Q&A. Do any of the panelists have anything they'd like to comment on or add to what you've heard yet?
I don't.
Great. Well, I have a question, and I think you all have you've addressed this in your own ways in your intros, but I just wanted to be explicit about the term food justice, as that is sort of in the title of our webinar. And if you could say what that term means to you, what the term food justice means to you, or if you actually use that term in your work, or if you have another way of conceptualizing sort of that same concept, or you prefer to use other words for that. Does anybody want to jump in on that?
I can go. Can you hear me okay?
We hear
My
you.
reception is bad. Okay, good. I think I personally don't use food justice in my work or activism or any of those words, only because I think there's a professional class of people that does that work, and I don't consider myself part of that class of people. And I also, in terms of activism, don't necessarily want to relegate what I think are, universal truths to the margin of activism, and not to call activists marginal or their work marginal, but I think by definition they're peripheral to the system. But when I think of food justice, I think of three things. I think of access, knowledge, and choice. I think that that folks have to have the knowledge of what is healthful foods for them. Then they have to have access to these foods, whatever that might be, and then they have to have the choice to, consume or not consume those helpful foods. I think for me, if those three things are present, then there's justice. But I also think of maybe something I'm calling like a pragmatic justice, and this is when you are in community, and by definition, community requires politicking, and so that's negotiating personal or communal preferences relative to other personal or communal preferences. And so building consensus, solidarity is important. So I think on a sort of like individual level, those three things are important, but like on a say communal level, when we start entering into more complex systems and more complex relationships, I think justice also becomes more complex in my mind. Thank
you. I guess I could jump in. So obviously, food justice, from the perspective of just the indigenous foodways and the work that we really look into, for me personally, it's just because of the environment that I grew up on, so growing up on Pine Ridge Reservation in South Dakota, we had one grocery store to service an area the size of Connecticut. I'm pretty sure there's more than one grocery store in Connecticut. So, and, there was very little nutritional food access out there. We grew up hunting, we grew up harvesting some things that were out there, but when, where I came from, the Lakota, that when they were pushed onto Pine Ridge Reservation, they were kind of given some of the worst land to try and work with, and they tried to farm, but there's nothing farming. You can't farm in the Badlands, and it's just really sandy and dry soil, and it's really tough. And plus, we didn't have the resources or education to work that kind of system in there, anyways. And a lot of our land space gets leased out, and we still have that situation where you look at a lot of the land on the reservations, most of it's leased out by non-native people, and they're using it for various, mostly like cattle ranching and stuff where we are. But there's just a lot of there's just no access to good nutritional food out there. And we see and plus just being stuck on things like the FDPIR and the Commodity Food Program, we're suffering from so much foodborne illness out there. We just had a young chef who worked with us pass away just this week. He was only 30 years old, and he died of a massive heart attack because he grew up on the same reservation that I did. And we had, because of that situation, we have very poor eating habits, and it's really hard. It's really hard to change diets, when you grow up with very low nutrition in your food sources and just way too many carbs. And there's a lot of convenience stores, but try eating healthy out of a convenience store. And it really just becomes that same issue with like it's your zip code that is determining how healthy you're going to be and how long you're going to live. And I think the average age for a male on Pine Ridge is about my age. I think it's about 48, and it's one of the lowest in all of the United States. So a lot of things need to change, and I just feel like we don't. If you look at what indigenous food systems were as commonalities on a global scale, indigenous food systems historically were just community-based food systems that utilized a mix of agriculture and permaculture largely, but there's obviously a lot of areas where agriculture didn't happen too, especially in North America and various parts of the world. But we just look at how people were surviving, and food did not have a monetary value, but communities were still able to live very healthy. And we still see a very clear path on how to get back there, but it needs to be largely a group effort, and it's largely an educational situation when it comes down to it. So that's why we're pushing back with trying to push more indigenous knowledge bases out there and activate them and utilize them on a daily basis. At the same time, just creating that access to healthy indigenous foods and just opening up to what's around us, because the Western diet's just completely ignored like the diversity of plant life around us in all of our various regions, and just has worked so hard to homogenize basically everything. And we should just be utilizing the world around us. We should be utilizing these plants around us. We should be focused on planting as much food as we can all over the place, which is going to be better for the soil anyways. And we still have to work through some massive crisis problems coming up, which will be climate change, which will be water access, and land access is just always going to be an issue when it comes to especially people of color. So there's a lot of work that has to be done on multiple levels of things. And we're just trying to role model the best we can, real changes that can happen within a lifetime, but we're just really trying to set up, again, the structural foundation of these changes that can happen over a few lifetimes, to make sure that the following generations really can have access. We can start to break that cycle of basically white supremacy and capitalization and globalization, and really, get people to control their food, because if you can control your food, you can control your destiny, and we need to get back to that situation.
Yeah, in my mind, I kind of think of food justice kind of from three different angles, just like where we are, where we're going, and how we get there. And so, like when I think about just the East End and the community that I live in, there's technically 5 grocery stores. There's a huge Walmart and a Fiesta and a couple like smaller chains, but there's also like 90 restaurants, 60 restaurants, which like 90% are taquerias. There's over 30 convenience stores and over 30 fast food restaurants. And so it's just, the option is basically just unhealthy food, and that's the glut of cheap foods that our commodity system has put into our system, and basically at every level. The food system is basically extractive, exploitative, and destructive. And I think it's important for us to kind of, how do we bring that into what people are experiencing on a day-to-day? Because I think a lot of us in the city and our community, this is just how it is. And we kind of accept that. We almost don't even think of another option or have a vision of what a community that had good foods would even look like or operate. So, and then I think it's like, where do we want to go? Like, what is that vision for what we're trying to create? And I think it's, it's communities that actually have the tools and the knowledge and autonomy to drive their own health and economy. And like food being a human right, and that being nutritious food that's cultivated in a sustainable way, in the place that you live, and that you're a part of that. And then I think lastly, just like, what is our action and how do we get there? Like how are we personally involved in that system? And I think, I asked this question of like, who's connected to agriculture in a lot of my presentations, and like no one raises their hand. And then I say, who eats food? And everyone raises their hand. And it's amazing just the way that our modern and culture has kind of created this illusion of disconnection, to where even though we're all like directly connected to this machine of a system, we just don't recognize how we kind of fit into that. And I think we don't talk about food justice as much externally through our work, but I think internally it's something that drives us, of how do we bring people into this conversation, and seeing that as part of my journey and our continuing journey as an individual and organization. And then how do we get other people to start seeing like the realities of our neighborhood is not just like statistics, but these are actually the symptoms of what the system has been designed to create, and what are the avenues for us to start shifting that.
I want to get to a couple of the questions that are coming through, but you led us so nicely to another question I had, Tommy, and all of you. So this is for all of the panelists. I sense there's this tension sometimes in environmental discussions and environmental studies between a concern for healthy food. Obviously, that's something we all want, but also a concern about the unequal access. And I'd just be curious to hear, and Tunde sort of hinted at this indirectly or not explicitly, but I'd just be curious to hear how you all navigate that, or what your thoughts are about that tension, if it's resolvable or not.
I'll just say that I think having perspective on where we are is really important, because it's like we're so far away from like being able to produce all of our food sustainably. It's hard to just say like it's either or. We're really in just, I've only found it to be like sanely approaching the problem by having like a really long-term perspective of how we kind of move the needle and include communities in like finding place-based solutions for that. So that would be my 2 cents. It's like, yeah, we really need to. And it's like in Houston, there's like so few farms. It's like, how do we make our food not just a luxury item for, I feel like if people actually knew the value of what our food is and like how scarce like sustainably grown quality food is in our community, we would be charging ridiculous amounts. And so it's like, how do we kind of bridge that gap? And yeah, I think that's just having a longer term view.
I actually don't understand the question.
It was just about, I don't think the sides are talking to each other, but sometimes food justice or environmental studies conversations can be very focused on unequal access, usually referring to racial disparities, economic disparities. And then there's another camp that is seemingly very narrowly concerned with access to healthy food, and they don't always acknowledge the economic factors that might make it difficult to access healthy food for certain communities. And so I thought your projects that you were, the bullshit, the agege bread, the spirit, were a very clever way of not explicitly but implicitly navigating that, by sort of turning these items that are very, I guess, available to you in Nigeria, but making them more difficult to access to those of us who typically do have access. I don't know if that clarifies the question. I can keep going, but I want to give you a chance to respond.
Yeah, no, thank you. I think, again, I think it depends on what we mean by justice, and specifically maybe even food justice or environmental justice. I think that there are conditions that could exist where we could meet, say, like a just food future present, and a sustainable environment that isn't, say, emotionally or psychically healthy for folks. Like I think understanding what the goal is, like if we want people well fed and healthy, that's different from striving for, say, a more materially equitable world. Like you have a lot of people who are affluent in the United States, but are disconnected from themselves because of the labor that they do. I think specifically of, I want to say doctors or folks in academia, for example, folks who, may find their work rewarding, may find the compensation rewarding as well, but there's something about their participation in the market system, in the economic system, that is still not healthy and is still not just. And so, I think understanding what it is we want maybe is a good first step. So for some people who are interested in just having people have access to healthy food, then that's their mission. Some people who want to like completely rearrange the entire system and change the racial and economic and gender dynamics at play, that's a different thing as well. I think for me personally, I think I tend to begin from more material conditions, and in those conditions, then you have the interplay of race, gender, economics, and the rest.
I wanted to maybe add on to that briefly. I was struck by each panelist, the way that you each addressed access in a different way in talking about your definitions of food justice and how that fits into your work. And Tunde, as you were talking just now, I was thinking about how to understand justice in different ways, in particular if we're not talking about redistributive aims within a project of justice. So I was thinking, for example, of big organic farms, which might do some work towards providing healthy, relatively sustainably produced food for some people, but the wealth that those farms produce continues to accrue to the people who are already wealthy, who are already benefiting from the economic system in which it is produced. And I was really struck in what you all were saying about thinking about access in a broader way as a component of understanding what the word justice means in food justice. So we heard some about access to land, access to water, but also access to knowledge as well. So understanding how to work with the place where you are and the materials that you have available to you, but also knowledge about like what capitalism is, what colonialism is, what those processes have done in the world, and how producing change might interact with those systems. So I think that's a really valuable contribution that comes out from what y'all are sharing. And in coming up with this question, I was thinking a lot about how in teaching environmental justice, we often talk a lot in those classes with students about injustice, about harms that are done, about tragic consequences, about environmental harms. And we have a much harder time pinning down the idea of like, and what is justice then? And one way that we really get to that in our classes is when we do start to talk about farming. And we talk about the liberatory potential of agriculture, of reconnecting folks to their heritage foodways or to their traditional land or to the understanding the places where they are, the places that are their homes. And so I think a broader understanding of justice is emerging, that it's not just about what is lacking, what we need to provide, but also what we already have before us and how to use that in a more just fashion. That's what I hear coming from the dialogue between you all. I don't know, Sean, if you wanted to add on to recent turns in the conversation.
Yeah, I mean, obviously it's a complicated question, and there's a lot of issues out there for people to work through. And we're really focused on just trying to make real solutions that we could help implement and impact in today's world right now. And again, like we're just working directly with tribal communities and helping to influence them on the possibilities of what a modern indigenous diet could look like and how accessible it actually can be. And I think the pandemic really showed so many people like how delicate, are the way people, the restaurants, especially with the food systems, like how they rely on all these foods coming from all over the place. And, we never had to worry about that because we just use local foods and we just built our menus around what was there, and, we've just tried to do so much work as needed. We believe everybody needs access to healthy foods, and we're just role modeling our particular style of healthy indigenous foods, which is very regional. So, we make very particular recipes from very particular regions, but we really try to showcase indigenous food products from indigenous peoples. And it's just that constant conversation around just privilege mostly when it comes down to it. And we just really want to influence this new generation of young Indigenous peoples to really reclaim a lot of what was attempted to strip away from them. And some tribes have lost almost everything when it comes down to it. And, there's just so much conversation around food, and we just have to make those solutions. So I feel like we are working with some tribes, and we're helping them to develop their own healthy Indigenous food operations within their community centers. We're helping to connect them to find more Indigenous seed varietals that will grow really well in those particular areas, and people who are really good at helping them to navigate to setting up some of these community gardens and farms, which is really hard work, and dealing with the water access issue, dealing with the soil health issues, and all those pieces, and just thinking about permaculture. Like, we worked with a farm who built an entire food forest quite a few years ago, and now it's just fruiting so much every single year, but then it's always also like, how do you take all of that and how do you process it? So it's really important that we use kitchen professionals to help people set up systems so they can take all this product in and dry it out or preserve it, however they're going to preserve it, just so they can create all that pantry that could be utilized for that community particularly. We're working with our city in Minneapolis to do that same situation, to create a path of what would a city food forest look like and how could we harvest it. And we would need volunteer help to be able to pull that all together. So I think there's a lot of smart people out there. There's a lot of solutions of the situations. It's going to get weirder and harder, I think, as it moves forward. But I feel like we have a lot of really intensely smart people working on these big issues. And, again, we're just using the restaurant as a showcase model of what's possible, and the nonprofit at the same time, and just kind of walking in both those worlds. But it really, I feel like education is one of the most important pieces to it, and getting people access to working on this stuff. I mean, we used to have just there should be such basics of cooking classes and gardening classes and things like that you would think should be out there, but they're not. So we're creating systems for community classes, and because we're a nonprofit, we can offset the costs of those for people to take those and have that access to learn how to do all this stuff, because it's so much work, but it's so important. And we just need to be able to eat healthy. And I think anybody who eats healthy knows the difference, but a lot of people who don't have that access just don't even know that. They don't even know what to compare it to. They just know what their diets are, which is basically what I was born with, just eating government powdered milk and government frosted flakes or whatever they might be, and that's just what I had, and that's still out there today. So there's so much change that has to happen.
I think that ties into a more practically oriented question in the Q&A, and you touched on this, Sean, just about the kind of classes and the kind of knowledge production and knowledge resources that the Indigenous Food Lab is able to offer, and also the popularity of the restaurant is another example. But Matthew Hansen has a question of, how can I locate Indigenous farmers and producers specifically in West Texas and Eastern New Mexico? And I don't know about the specificity of that regional question, but maybe a more general response to some avenues that folks might pursue if they're seeking to connect with their own regional sources to learn about Indigenous foodways in the places where they are.
I can speak just to, there's a group out there in New Mexico called Traditional Native American Farmers Association, TNAFA, whatever. And Clayton Brascoop, I believe, is the farmer's name, but he's been really kind of leading a lot of that. They live in, I can't remember the name of the town, but they're doing a lot of great work. There's a lot, and Native Seed Search is down in Arizona too, and they're well connected to a lot of groups out there. But I feel like when people start kind of connecting to some of those pieces, that there's just been this kind of blossoming of more Indigenous seed keepers out there, more Indigenous farms happening, more access to these Indigenous seeds, especially for Indigenous growers. And I'm seeing a lot more indigenous chefs start to come out, and because again, we're so unique with what we're doing at the restaurant, but it shouldn't be, because there should be native restaurants all across everywhere, every region, celebrating the history of the land that people are standing on when it comes down to it. And but I think it's easy to connect. There's a lot of information out there, but again, it's very minute. There's not a lot of it, and we need to see more and more.
There's another question in the chat about something that hasn't, again, explicitly come up, but the issue of food waste. And I wonder if this, perhaps Tommy, I'm sure it comes up on the farm, but as chefs, as a cook, Tunde, how do you think about, I guess I would expand the question, how do you think about food waste, but also do you think about environmental issues as being part of the food work that you're doing?
Yeah, I can start. Honestly, I think about waste in general. I don't think about food waste specifically. My vantage point is from my interest is in the continent, and is in the history of exploitation here. I think about single-use plastic that is everywhere, used to package food or drink. So that's the sort of waste that I think about, and this waste is like a product of a particular system, and particular economic system, and I don't know how we get to addressing these problems without addressing the root of the problem, which is the economic system in my mind. And that root is connected to other roots. It's sort of a rhizomatic situation. So yeah, I definitely don't think about food waste in isolation.
I can go because we address it all the time too, but we just are very conscious because we have so much farm product coming in at us, and plus with our nonprofit we get donated a lot of food, and we've been doing a lot of food relief because we were doing 10,000 meals a week out of our little kitchen, and our little kitchen is it's right on Lake Street in Minneapolis, which is the street that got hit the most with the social uprising after George Floyd's death in Minneapolis. And that's kind of what we were born into, because all the buildings around us are completely burned down to the ground. And we're right in the middle of the pandemic, it was that late May, early June, and we just started doing all of that food relief. And we had all these farmers who just didn't know what to do with a bunch of product, because all of a sudden they had no restaurants to sell anything to. So we started setting up systems to making sure that we could figure out ways to not only purchase that food from them, but also make sure that that food finds a home somehow and that it gets processed. So we were dehydrating so much stuff, we were canning so much stuff, and we tried not to freeze too much because you can still lose product by freezing it, but we still had to freeze quite a bit of stuff. But because of the volume that we were going through, we were able to just process an immense amount of food and just really try to help out all these local growers around us, And in the restaurant, and just on the day-to-day, that's just practice that all restaurant groups should really try to strive for, is just much less waste, because of those can be extremely wasteful situations, And so we try to send a lot of food home if we just absolutely can't figure out what if we can't serve it again, and just make sure it goes to some of our employees. But of course, we just dehydrate like so much stuff. We just have a huge pantry of just all sorts of dehydrated vegetables and things that we get to use throughout the rest of the year, So we just, I think that we have to be very conscious, especially as restaurant owners out there, of just better ways, and not just throwing everything away, and food costs and food waste is a huge issue always in restaurants, but just thinking larger, like how do we help our local farms? How do we help move some of those products, and we're just buying stuff, have people who are having farmers market booths and have them contact me when they're done to see what they need to move, and we'll see if we have a home for it, or see if we have a way to figure it out between the nonprofit work and the restaurant work, and all the other pieces. So, but we're different now because we have all these resources, which we didn't have a few years ago. Because like when I started the sous chef, I had no resources. I didn't grow up with money. I didn't even know how to navigate finances or banks to even think about opening up a restaurant at that time. I think my credit score was like 420, back then. And it was a struggle to get to this point to be able to do all these things and have all this stuff. And now we're just trying to create avenues for other people so they don't have to go through the intensity of what I had to go through to start some of this, but again, like it's just trying to figure out. That's why I think kitchens are so important. I think it's really important. We should have more community-based kitchens where people could have access to some of these situations. So, if they have a whole bunch of wild apples out there and they can harvest them and do something with them, those can be pantry items, and we should just be looking at what's around us. So I guess that's my perspective.
And I think that question offers us such a wonderful way into thinking about the way that different actors in the food system can work together, thinking about what it really means to talk about food waste, because there is such a wealth of food produced in the United States, and yet there are many people who are hungry, and there is a great deal of food wasted as well. And I think what we're hearing is, there's commercial kitchens and of course people's home use, but there's also mutual aid networks. There's also nonprofit organizations, and finding a way to redistribute resources to those who are seeking or who have the capacity, say, to process and redistribute in a different form is super important. And I think especially, in bigger cities, there's a plethora of mutual aid networks that are, for example, trying to provide food for unhoused people or providing food for hungry people in an informal fashion. And so figuring out what those networks are and trying to connect them with organizations that have more institutional power is super important. Tommy, were you gonna jump in there?
Yeah, I was going to give a farmer perspective here. I think a big part of just like working to connect our product to like individuals in particular in our community has been something. It's just like trying to shrink that distance between myself and the outlets. And I think also having a diversity of outlets for us between the CSA, the farm stand, and like wholesale being kind of the final outlet for us when we needed, has been super important, because it's like over the last 8 years, we've been able to build out those networks to where the food's not going very far. And we also kind of have hit the threshold of what our capacity as a farm is. So at the end of every week, there's just not very much left over. And what is left over, we found community partners or chefs potentially that can just like take that. So I think our scale kind of fits within like really knowing how much we can produce and where it can go. And I think that's been like super important to us. And then being in an urban setting, it's like other farmers are now reaching out to us, especially after the pandemic, that were looking for direct to customer sales because restaurants were closed. And so we became an avenue for helping and still helping. Like we build the demand. I'm on 1.25 acres and I can only feed so many people with that food, but we're surrounded by 30,000 households and 80,000 individuals. And it should be our role as a farm to, grow that demand and connection and make it convenient for farmers.
Can I add something? That's okay.
Please.
I just want to maybe illustrate like a connectivity that I think about. So where I live, when it's rainy season or it's not the rainy season, really, because of poor infrastructure, what happens is that some roads get flooded. And then when that happens, usually, or sometimes when it happens, the local government would like try and address that flooding. So to be specific, down the road from me, there's a road that gets flooded. They decided to create like a little hump so that the water can flow through underneath it. So they broke the road. They delayed, or the construction it was a tiny road. It took a month. So the journey, which is like about half a mile, that should just usually take 7 minutes, took an hour. And it was not like an hour for a week, it was an hour for a month. So people who were making that commute, and this tiny road sees, I don't know, hundreds of thousands of people go by it. Why they had to break the road and why the drainage was clogged was because of disposable plastic from water. These clamshell takeout containers, plastic from snacks. It literally accumulated that much. And so when you think about the system that we're in, the system that has sort of like price and profit as the logic that regulates demand and supply, that's the system that needs to be targeted, because as long as people can make a profit without thinking about the externalities, or as long as the externalities such as what I have mentioned, poor infrastructure that ultimately leads to a low quality of life for the folks living in the community, as long as those people are incentivized to keep making a profit and keep making products that are easily disposable, then this issue of waste can't be solved. I mean, we can solve it in isolation, we can solve it in like affluent communities, or we can solve it in communities that can get grants or funding from affluent communities. But the worst of it, which is true and will always be true, will be pushed out to the periphery. And what is the periphery is really the majority of our global system. Like, more people live on the so-called periphery than not. So I think for me, that's the question. Is how do we start to, if not displace the logic of our economic system, question it so thoroughly that things begin to shift.
Fantastic. I think, unfortunately, we're right at about time. So I don't know if any folks have anything you want to wrap up with or any parting thoughts before we disperse, but I have just so immensely enjoyed this conversation, and I'm sure everyone who attended did as well. And I can't wait to continue grappling and thinking about the things that you brought up tonight. But I want to give Sophie and Jade an opportunity to ask any final things or make any final remarks you'd like before we depart. And thank you again deeply for this wonderful conversation.
Thanks, Weston. I just also wanted to thank the panelists, and as we've been gesturing towards, it's just been really interesting to hear all of your different perspectives. You all are in different positions in the food system. We have, farmer to restaurateur. So it's just been really fascinating to hear these connections you all are making. So thank you.
Yeah, so I think just want to end by thanking everybody for sharing your work, but also for sharing about yourselves and how you bring yourselves, your experience, your history into the work that you do. I think that's really valuable for our audience, and for how that we can all think about food justice, or working towards a more just food system, as something that is accessible to all of us and is connected to all of our personal stories, our personal experiences. And this was just such a fulfilling conversation for me. I thank you all so much for joining us. It was such a treat.
And for any Rice students around, Sophie will be teaching a food in the justice system course next year that you should plug really quick.
That's right, I will. It's Environmental Studies 312. It's in the fall. And we will be talking about these very topics that we have discussed today. So we're talking in particular about race, class, and gender, and about processes like capitalism, colonialism, empire, their impact on the food system, and thinking about how we might work towards creating a more just food system for us and for those around us in our communities. I would love to see all students there.
All right, thank you again, everyone. We have so enjoyed this, and we look forward to seeing more and learning from you in the future. Thanks.